Today I'm joined by two guests. Shiva Ayyadurai is known as the inventor of email, which is a very controversial title. We'll be discussing that. And currently he's the CEO of Cytosolve. He holds 4 degrees from MIT, including a PhD in biological engineering. And also Jordan Flesher, who's authored some articles with Deepak Chopra in journals like Huffington Post. So we'll be discussing with both of them the nature of this academic scientific establishment that tries to control the information and knowledge that's disseminated to us. Thank you guys for joining us.
Great to be here.
So let's start, Shiva, with your history a little bit, because obviously your title is the inventor of email, as the official word email that you were the first to copyright, and yet that's, to this day, it's still disputed and in sort of the press, I would say, the public mainstream discourse dispute whether or not you really invented email. So why don't you go ahead and tell us your story of how you invented it and why you claimed that title?
Sure, I think it's an important question because it not only opens up the opportunity to understand how truth is manufactured or unmanufactured, but also gives us an insight into what's going on in terms of the modern world and who actually controls narratives. So if you look at the facts, the black and white facts are here as a kid, which was me. I was born in India in 1963. My parents came here in 1970. And I grew up in an environment in India which was with a grandmother who could observe your face and she could predict what was going on in your body. It was a form of Indian medicine. So I was very moved to study Indian medicine. So when I came here in 1970, worked very hard as a 7-year-old. By the time I was 14, I'd completed all my math courses and ended up getting accepted to a special program at New York University. In fact, 40 students were selected to study computer programming. And after I finished that, I started working at a medical school because I thought I'd get to do medical research. And the early medical research I did was using computers to understand how babies were dying in their sleep. So it was my first introduction in integrating computing with medicine. But while I was at that medical school, I was given another bigger challenge, and a challenge in actually creating large-scale systems. And if people look back at 1978, let's look at what was going on there. Who used computers? It was typically old white guys who were in slide rules, very technical people, and you worked on large mainframe computers. And in that medical school, you also had women. These women were relegated always to being the secretary. In fact, a woman could only be a secretary, nurse, or housewife, and maybe a teacher. They had a typewriter on their desk. They had this thing called an inbox and an outbox. They had folders. They had a trash can. They had the address book. They would write this thing called a memo, which had the to, from, subject, CC. Sound familiar? Mm-hmm. And this system was where this woman would create a memo, put it in an interoffice mail envelope, and distribute it. And so this was a very complex system because all business got done through this system, all collaborative, how you hired some people, how you did grants. It was the infrastructure of business office communications throughout the world. Mm-hmm. So this 14-year-old kid gets this opportunity to convert that to the electronic form. It's a big opportunity, and I took it on, and what I created was what I called email, E-M-A-I-L, a term never used before in the English language. So not only does this kid create this term, but he also creates a system, as we know, as email.
What was the email? It was electronic mail?
Well, see, the word electronic mail is interesting. That's existed since the 1800s, which referred to any type of electronification of anything paper. So that would mean telegraph is electronic mail or faxes.
Right.
But when we say email, E-M-A-I-L, and the reason I called it email was a Fortran language in those days only allowed 5 characters. So it's not an obvious term.
I see.
All right, in fact, if you look at the Oxford English Dictionary, it puts it at 79, and Merriam-Webster puts it at 82. But this kid not only created the term email, he actually created the system, email, uppercase or lowercase. Mm-hmm. So what was email? Email was the electronic version of the interoffice mail system. That is what email is. When we all log in, we don't do text messaging. We use inbox, outbox, folders, address book.
Right.
Now it gets a little more interesting than that. So not only did I create the software, you got to understand in 1978, the United States innovation laws had not caught up with inventors. So which means no one knew what software was. It was only in 1980 did the Computer Act of 1980 emerge, which was the amendment to the Copyright Act of 1976, which allowed me to protect software through copyright. Mm-hmm. So in 1981, I was at MIT. I was in the president's house for dinner, and he said, Shiva, what you should do is you should copyright it. It's unfortunate the Supreme Court doesn't allow you to patent it. So this 17-year-old kid applies for the copyright, And I get the official copyright on August 30th, 1982, recognizing me legally as the inventor of email. So if you look at the facts, here's a kid who invented email, called it email, and has the official copyright. Now the problem is I didn't promote it. I was brought up in a humble Indian family. In fact, when I came to MIT, the front page highlighted 3 students who had done something very noteworthy out of the 1,041 who were accepted, probably out of the 100,000 who applied. So that's the facts. March forward 30 years, my mother's dying of pulmonary fibrosis. In a suitcase, she leaves all this material. And a friend of mine comes over as a professor of media. He said, Shiva, you invented email. Why haven't you talked about this? And Doug Amiff from Time magazine comes over, who's a technology editor. He goes through this meticulously and he writes an article called The Man Who Invented Email in Time. That didn't create controversy. But on February 16th, 2012, the Smithsonian wanted all my materials, and that's when it went in. And a young Washington Post reporter writes an article called V.A. Shiva Honored as the Inventor of Email. And that's the date, which should have been an occasion for celebration of the American dream. You see this vitriol explode, people calling me an asshole, a dick.
Right.
This curry-stained Indian should be beaten and hanged. And who was behind this? And as you unravel it, you find it's Raytheon, one of the largest defense companies in the world, their group of industry insiders, including academic historians. You see, they'd already written the narrative on email,
Right.
that it was done by the military, a guy who looked the part with a beard, white glasses, a white guy. And I've never played the race card, by the way, Sean, ever in my life for anything I've gotten. But when you look at this, it's not only race, there's class, and there's a military-industrial complex. Because what you realize was as long as I was at MIT in those 33 years, I was on the front page of MIT 3 times for inventing many other things. But when I said email was done before I came to MIT, you perturbed this huge narrative.
Right.
Remember, who started Raytheon was a former president of MIT. So the narrative is you go to MIT, you get branded, and then you can be an inventor. But a 14-year-old, dark-skinned Indian kid in Newark, where nothing's supposed to come out of Newark, he could never be the inventor of email. And if you know, there's a triangle, they call it the triangle, the golden triangle. Walter Isaacson, a liberal writer, talks about it. In the midst of this controversy with these guys created, it was a fabricated controversy. The fraud is that Raytheon and Ray Tomlinson invented email. It's the biggest technology fraud.
And
so
what do you think, I mean, ultimately, what do they gain by this claim?
So many
Is it
things.
financial, or
So let's look at 3 layers. You know, it's multiple layers. So the first thing is the most immediate thing, which mainstream media doesn't want to follow, because if you look at Huffington Post, which, by the way, ran 5 articles last year, and they were so attacked that Ariana pulled down those articles. Well, who advertises in the Huffington Post? Raytheon does, okay? So what's really the motive here? In 2009, Raytheon bought this company, BB&N, which is where this guy Tomlinson was, and they rebranded themselves as the inventors of email. Now, why? The cybersecurity market is a $70 billion market. Raytheon competes with Northrop Grumman and General Dynamics. So a lot of these missile guys reposition themselves in the cybersecurity market. And part of that branding, if you read Raytheon's own marketing literature, they say reputation is key. So promoting Tomlinson as the inventor of email gives them this, you know, in probably their RFPs, a significant advantage. Oh, we invented email, so we're the ones who can protect you in email. 2014, Raytheon made $260 million just that year in cybersecurity contracts. So their branding at that time was the @ symbol, a picture of Tomlinson, and they're the innovators. So if a 14-year-old kid invented email, that sort of destroys their marketing. So what Raytheon's faced in right now is their marketing campaign and the factual records.
Right.
So 3 weeks ago, in fact, Ray Tomlinson died. Raytheon took to the airwaves saying the inventor of email has died. But fortunately, over the last 3 years, we've been educating people, and you can see that the narrative is shifting where people are questioning this narrative.
Right, exactly. Well, let's talk about questioning narratives, Jordan. I mean, you're working with someone like Deepak Chopra, who is very much involved in trying to fight what is considered, really what is a scientific establishment. So why don't you describe how you perceive that establishment to be? What are some of the basic ideologies of that establishment, and how does it function in our society?
Well, first off, in psychology, one of the newest therapies is actually called narrative therapy, and it's based off of the infamous sociologist named Michel Foucault. And he actually talked about how certain discourses that are not part of the dominant discourse, which is usually white privilege, essentially, or reductionistic science, gets subjugated or kind of pushed away to the sidelines. So there's all kinds of forces that are trying to suppress the discourses. So I think that the biggest discourse that's sort of claimed as the main authority on what is true, like how you open the show, about like what is the truth, is science, but it's actually science defined by a small group of people. That's not necessarily science, because science is something, like I'm Native American, science is an inward journey, but according to what we think of as science today, the inward is taboo. It's taboo to go within, because then you fall into what's called subjectivity bias, according to that discourse, though. So it's all related, but what we think of as science is not necessarily science. So Deepak, who's someone from another discourse, Vedanta, Ayurveda, he's saying, like, him and I, there's more, we're like a different discourse, we're in a different voice. There's more to science than what they teach in school.
Of course, but I mean, it's fascinating to me how we've come to this place where people like to argue that you're either pro-science or pro-religion, not realizing that there's actually a dogma to both ways of seeing the world. And there's actually within many great scientists have been spiritual people, have believed in God, have had faith, and yet they're still able to approach science from the perspective of truth, right? An actual quest for truth, not knowing definitively, because most, how do you say it? There are very few laws that we know of in reality, in the universe, right? Most things are hypotheses. And yet people like to elaborate those hypotheses to say, assert them as though it is the entirety of reality, as opposed to saying, no, it's an hypothesis that we're working from in our quest for truth. So as opposed to seeing science as a continual desire to learn and open our mind and expand more, instead we see people trying to hide behind this shield of saying, no, it's definitive, it's proven, it's dogmatic, you must believe this, you can't question it, and if you find any evidence that opposes it, you must be wrong. So, based on that perspective, I guess it's more reductionist. I know you've experienced that also, Shiva, in your engagement with the scientific realm in terms of your work after the development of email, as far as your work in biological engineering and whatnot. So why don't you talk about how you've encountered this type of reductionism in your experience?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting, you bring up a good point. We have two priesthoods right now. You have the reductionist priesthood, and you also have the religious priesthood, and both of them don't give the truth. What's interesting, though, is if you look back at the history of science, one of the interesting areas where you can find truth to this extent is that people have to build something. In Hermann Hesse's book, ultimately, Siddhartha says it's not your thoughts or your words, but what you create. So if you have to build an airplane, right, you can't bullshit around, right? Either the thing's going to fly or not. It has to follow certain laws. If you have to achieve something. And what's fascinating is, from an engineering perspective, it's not about perfection. It's about you have a goal, and you're constantly making adjustments to it. And you have to bring in reality into it. So I think in one of the previous slides, if you look at biology, what occurred in 2003 was fascinating, because when the Human Genome Project started, I think as you can see in one of the slides, is that we went into the Genome Project thinking that what made a human being different than a worm was the actual number of genes. So it's a reductionist concept that complexity is related to number of genes. And in one of those graphs, you'll see that what finds out by 2003, the irony of the Genome Project is we find out we have the same number of genes as a worm, right? So we're not our genes. So that essentially in 2003 opened up biology to recognize we had to do systems biology. Systems biology mean we need that the truth comes out from the interconnections, not from the parts, but how the parts interconnect. So interconnection becomes the key.
Exactly.
Right? So piecing together the pieces and understanding the glue that connects things. So when I went back to MIT in 2003 for my PhD, in this diagram here, you can start to see these interconnections here, that if you look at any biological phenomenon, ultimately it's the interconnections of molecular pathways, which means how these molecules interact. And from those interactions, truth emerges. So truth is actually an emergent property of these interactions. So one of the challenges that the National Science Foundation had in 2003 was, could you mathematically model the human cell? Right, it's a pretty interesting problem because right now biologists are like these blind men who work in little fiefdoms. They look at the parts. Could you connect those parts together, and could you evoke what's really going on? So when I went back, I spent about 10 years at MIT, and this was when I was 40, so I had to go back in a whole different way. But I applied the same principles I used to build email, which was email was the interconnection of these parts of a system. And what we built was we built this technology called Cyto, meaning the cell solve. And CytoSolve was a electronic way to model molecular pathways, systems of systems of systems of pathways. So if email was the electronic version of the mail communication system, CytoSolve is the electronic version of the molecular communication system. So we wrote many papers, cited in major papers like Nature, Cell. Pfizer, for example, recently signed to start using this because they know their drug development model sucks. It doesn't really work.
Right.
So some of the enlightened people actually want to use CytoSolve. A lot of the functional food companies want to use it to really find out the difference between snake oil and supplements and what works. And we've actually used CytoSolve to actually validate some traditional systems of medicine. So it's a revolution. If email was a revolution, CytoSolve is even going to be a bigger revolution.
Yeah.
But that's how I got involved in the Monsanto, and the whole GMO debate. I don't know if you want me to talk about that, but
Absolutely.
but here's the interesting thing, right? If you look at genetically engineered foods, genetically modified foods, let's take a very objective position. I'm not going to, let's say, as a scientist, I'm not pro or anti-GMO.
Right.
But let's take this position, which is what Monsanto and others have taken, that if you do an itsy weeny teeny weeny little change to soy, change one little gene, don't worry, it's not going to affect anything else. Right? So that's the supposition. And based on this, they have a principle called substantial equivalence. And what happens is you and I right now can start a GMO company. We could do a GMO blueberry. And in order to get it allowed to go to market, all we have to show is that GMO blueberry is substantially equivalent to the non-GMO version. So how do we do that? Well, we can choose any criteria we want, Sean. I can choose fat content, water content, and then we can just say, hey, look, it's about the same. In fact, plus or minus 20%. We send a letter to the FDA saying we did this analysis, and the FDA will send a letter back to us saying, Sean and Shiva, thank you very much for doing that analysis, that you've done that, and that's it. With that letter, we can go to market. The FDA, does not take a position on GMOs.
Right.
They simply issue what's called a safety consultation. It's up to you and me, self-regulation, that we did this material difference analysis.
Right. So there's never been an actual study, like a real study as far as what's the comparison of what GMO can cause as far as health consequence or consequence to the later generations.
Yeah. So there's two pillars that the GMO lobby stands on. One is, don't worry, this GMO is no different than the non-GMO counterpart. That's one pillar. And by the way, if you consume this GMO, it's not going to harm you. So we did our research was go after that first pillar. And we use systems biology. We use CytoSolve. And what we did was we said, let's take GMO soy, and we went through 11,000 papers that have been written in the literature. 11,000 papers. And from those 11,000 papers, we found 6,800 experiments had been done. And in those 6,000, across 184 institutions in 23 countries. So this is a distillation of the scientific method. And what we found in those research, and CytoSolve lets us aggregate this, we found a set of molecular pathways called C1 metabolism. Without getting into the details, this molecular system is in every plant, it's in every bacteria, and it's in every fungi. So first paper was we just published that very quietly. This is a C1 metabolism pathway. Second paper, what we did was we modeled that mathematically. And what we showed was in the normal case, non-GMO case, plants create formaldehyde, and they also get rid of formaldehyde, detoxify it. It's a system that they have. So at some level, all plants have a background level, but they have this capacity to detoxify it. In the third and fourth papers, what we showed was what happens when you do a genetic modification at the molecular level. And what we showed was that when you do that modification, particularly in soy, that it perturbs this entire system. That in fact glutathione, which is a master antioxidant, which we all should be taking for not, especially when you live in a polluted, stressed environment, that glutathione is depleted and formaldehyde accumulates. Glutathione is an antioxidant.
Right.
And in fact, what we showed was that genetic insertion, the plant goes into oxidative stress. It thinks it's being stressed out, very similar to when a plant undergoes when it's under drought or in different conditions.
Right.
So those are the 4 papers we published, and we said, look, we're open to criticism, but we need to take a systems approach. So that was the work we did. And what that resulted in was something very interesting, again, from this academic community, a guy called Kevin Folta. You can look him up. He's a head of the horticultural department of the University of Florida, which gets funded by Monsanto. He started attacking us, saying, by the way, this guy's a fraud. He didn't invent email. That was the first attack.
Of course.
And then went on to say this research is bogus. And throughout this entire attack is saying, I don't get a penny from Monsanto. People go look at his Twitter feed. Gary Ruskin, who's from US Right to Know, which we didn't know in parallel in January, had done a FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, against the University of Florida. 4,000 emails come out. One of those emails is actually a letter from Monsanto to Folta giving him $25,000 to be their spokesman.
Wow.
That finally appeared on the front page of the New York Times. Up until then, New York Times was cutting and copying Folta's bogus theories.
Accusations and theories.
Well, theories like plant breeding is the same as genetic engineering,
Yeah.
right? No big deal. This has been going on for 5,000 years. You know, conflating plant breeding with single genetic modification.
Exactly.
But you can see that the majority of scientists, including the major journals, will not say anything against Monsanto, right? The University of Iowa Student Center is funded by Monsanto. If you say anything, and you're at Cornell's agriculture department gets funded by Monsanto.
Right.
And
what we know about Iowa is that's corn country, right?
It's corn country
isn't
and soy.
Almost all corn in this country is basically now GMO.
91%
genetically
of corn,
modified, right?
94% of soy.
Wow.
So what you have is, I mean, this is no different than smoking, right? Robert Proctor wrote a book called The Golden Holocaust, showing how for 50 years scientists said smoking was good for you. So the real issue is who controls narratives on, be it innovation or science. And what you really find out is it is driven by war and the narrative of the military-industrial academic complex, which is what Eisenhower and Fulbright talked about. And we're living in that, and we need to address those issues. And I feel fortunate as a scientist to be able to speak out about it because I was a good enough inventor that I made my own money.
Yeah.
But most scientists don't have that luxury. You know, NIH funding has been cut. You become a professor, you got 7 years to get tenure. You got to take money from anywhere you can get it.
Right.
And those people are beholden to support these narratives.
Exactly, because who has the money in our society? It's the major corporations. They don't
Right.
have, you don't have small corporations anywhere. You barely have middle class or middle-sized mom and pop level of businesses anymore. It's all become conglomerates,
Right.
And so that's where the money is. So of course it's going to drive then the narrative. Jordan, what's your take on some of the ways to approach this system? I mean, this overall control of the scientific academic structures. I mean, how are you and Deepak, for example, approaching and sort of attacking this? Is it on a case by case? Is it going after certain scientists who you feel are basically representative of the system, or is it how do we create peace in a sense of real peace, which is economic prosperity, health, a prosperous lifestyle that's not based in the military, academic, scientific structures that we now have in place?
Where I begin is like with the individual. So, because if you look at it, even though we're taking a systems approach, I think you have to start with the individual, because even from like what we were saying before about discourses, you're told how to experience your own body through that type of science we were talking about before, like the dominant reductionistic science. Like, for example, science will say the moon is, it's just the moon. We landed on the moon. And basically anything like this astrology or a different culture's way of looking at the moon, or even your own experience of the moon, is, again, a subjugated discourse. It's taboo. You're taught how to experience everything through the dominant discourse of white science. So first you have to, it has to be with the individual. I take Krishnamurti's approach to large-scale social change, that you are the world. So I think it does have to do with people in a privileged position who can speak about it, like we're doing today, and bringing awareness. But I think mainly it has to do with individual awakening, and out of that individual awakening, there's going to be change. Because society is it's an abstraction in a way. It's sort of just, it's made up of individuals. So I think from the individual level is where the real change is happening. So through Facebook, social media, it's all what individual light bulbs go off, and then what they do naturally from that insight or that awakening, that consequence.
I know we were talking a little bit earlier about archetypes and the
Right.
nature of archetypes in the world, and you mentioned that Shiva might be an archetype of this ancient Indian Hindu god. How would you perceive him in that regard, or what's your take on the actual nature of archetypes? Is it possible that people basically do imbibe, or let's say are imbued with an energy from a divine force or power, do you think?
Yeah, actually, one of the most ancient archetypes is war. He used the word war. The Bhagavad Gita is a war. Like, people forget that this great spiritual awakening takes place in this archetype of war. And anytime there's an individual awakening, what happens is that individual gets more power, in a sense. So what's going to happen is there's going to be all kinds of other forces that are going to come up to suppress that power. So when we're talking about Monsanto and different things, we're talking about very large forces, very large powers, but it's also ancient, this sort of struggle to overcome these dark forces with the light, and to overcome and to triumph. It's very ancient, this whole thing. So I think you can look at things like that archetypally, which is a word, just think like archaeology, something ancient. So he's speaking to an ancient quest of the light to overcome the darkness. So I think you can look at it archetypally.
Well, if we're speaking about a war, then certainly the war is on with Monsanto, which is sort of what's called Monsatan, right? A lot of people realize that it's an epitome of evil because of what they're doing as far as modifying our food, and how it's going to affect, obviously, not only this crop and future generations, but our health as well. So I'm curious to know, like, how do you approach this fight?
Well, since you brought up Shiva, one of the I grew up in two worlds when I was in India, in Bombay, in a village. My grandparents were poor village farmers. And my grandmother was also a healer. So I was brought up lying in her lap, hearing all the great stories of the Ramayana, Shiva. But so one of the interesting things is, in the Western world, we have the devil with the trident, right? Shiva also carries a trident, but he pierces darkness. And so my grandmother brought me up saying, if you want to be a healer, ultimately you're a warrior, because you actually fight darkness. And so for me, this is very personal for me, because you see, India has a caste system. You won't find a lot of Indians like me, because we were brought up what was known as untouchables. So my journey is very different than the typical Indian here. So it's always been one of struggle, but one of also wanting to find truth. So, if you look back, separate from the science history, you'll see a picture of me burning the South African flag on the steps of MIT. I made sure more food service got better jobs, more women, minorities came to MIT. There's a picture of me making sure the US got out of Iraq on my PhD graduation. I raised a banner, half of the crowd booed me, and the other half...
What was the banner?
It said US out of Iraq, when it was unpopular to say that.
Right, of course.
Right? So when you look at where we are right now, the symbol of Shiva in many ways represents piercing darkness. And how do you pierce darkness? Well, one of the ways you do it is to teach people how things are interconnected. The symbol of Shiva or Hermes was about these archetypes who traverse heaven and earth. And they also went into the underworld. And that's sort of the archetype I've been sort of forced to do, because you could argue that the bowels of MIT are where the belly of the beast is, right? And I was in that beast for 33 years, and I know how the enemy thinks. And I know most of their thinking is based on being scribes in the background, avoiding controversy. These guys do not want controversy, because
the light shed upon them.
Yeah, because it's a threat to them. So the fact that I went and got 4 degrees from MIT, and I speak out against these issues, is a significant threat to this, because what you are taught is to be a good Gunga Din. I don't want to use some other words that Malcolm X used, right?
Of course.
So
yeah.
Indians are supposed to be good model minorities,
Yeah.
right? So I'm not willing to play that game, right? Because where I came from was poor village farmers who struggled, and that's who my people are. And I think the main point here is many indigenous cultures already had figured out a lot of these solutions. So what we live now is we have solutions that come out of wartime innovation. So if you look at the modern healthcare system, it came from putting a soldier back on the field. That's modern healthcare.
Right.
Secondary market was to repurpose it and say this should be the standard civilian healthcare. For thousands of years, Native Americans, Indians, Chinese, ordinary people, even all Celtics, we had our Africans, we had our own indigenous systems of medicine, which was not for war, which was based on sustaining life, and they built their whole systems. So you literally have these two things. Yes, we need crisis management healthcare. Sure. God forbid you get in a car accident, but that's not the modus operandi of normal healthcare.
Exactly. It begins with your food and diet. It begins
right.
With
so that's this other whole system that was created.
Yeah.
So there's two different system requirements. Take what we do with agriculture right now. It's repurposing of military. The Haber process was created to fixate nitrogen for creating weapons, TNT. Alfred Nobel, right? When war went away, they said, shit, what do we do? Let's reuse this nitrogen fixation for fertilizer. And now we're going to convince everyone on this planet that you need fertilizer. When for thousands of years people lived without fertilizer, you create this branding called the Green Revolution, right? That India needed it,
and therefore the 70s Rockefeller sold it to them.
70s
right?
Rockefeller. And the other important aspect is what people do not understand is America's biggest export is not industrial export, it's agriculture. So, and Henry Kissinger talked about it. He goes, the way you control other countries, you control their soil, right? So we export African babies all dying with these, big bloated stomachs. So you have the nonprofits who send out that, and then you control their soil.
Right.
Right, so we've destroyed a lot of the biodiversity of African grains, and we only distribute certain grains in there, which many of them, in fact, cause these famines. And then you have the Gates Foundation supporting this.
Right.
And no one discusses Bill Gates' history. No one questions whether he's really an innovator. No one talks about the fact that he bought DOS from somebody else and screwed a kid. But because he's got billions, he's a white guy, and he dropped out of Harvard, the question about his integrity as an innovator is never questioned.
And he can openly say we should reduce the population of the planet
exactly.
by about 2/3,
exactly.
or at least one half, and no one
and he has
questions
500,000 shares in Monsanto.
Yeah.
So so these narratives need to be busted up, and that was the noble goal of science. That is a noble goal of scientists, and more scientists need to step up to the plate. Otherwise, they're not doing science. They're basically lackeys for the military-industrial complex.
Yeah, but so that goes back to the question of how do you challenge Monsanto? How can you challenge Monsanto and really help raise awareness by obviously doing the work you're doing to expose the fact that their lies, not just them obviously, but the entire nature of the GMO, the lies of the safety of GMOs, that it can have no effect on health and whatnot?
Well, there's two ways we're doing it. One thing is I put my money where my mouth is, and I've been fortunately had some success. So I said I'd give them my $10 million building in Cambridge if Monsanto could disprove my research. And then I went back to my high school and we challenged them. They didn't show up. In fact, they sent a shill out there and she was completely exposed. The other thing that, I have a book coming out called The System in Revolution. And that book basically says, let's go back to basics. Let's teach people how every system in the universe operates. And there are principles: transport, movement of energy, conversion of energy, and storage. There's a whole theory called feedback control systems theory. And it turns out that the lingua franca that describes that matches one-to-one with Siddha and Ayurveda. These rishis of ancient times weren't just medical guys. They actually were looking at the body, everything around as a system. So we have a book coming out which we're going to train everyone how all systems operate, and then why you need revolution. Revolution is a part of all systems. It's called a phase transition. And these revolutions do not occur spontaneously. We as human beings can actually organize them. And then it's important for people to organize revolution. So it's a book that is going to educate ordinary people the dynamics of all systems. Your body is a system. In fact, we have a tool we're giving away for free that you can use the traditional systems of Indian medicine brought into modern terms so you can understand the body as a system. So it's not about diet. It's about seeing that how do you understand you and how do you create revolution within yourself. Right. But also you can use these same principles to understand societal change. So I think it's education. And I think, shows like what you're doing is sort of how we're going to win this, because the mainstream media is not incented to do this. They're too tied on too many levels. And once in a while, you'd be lucky a story comes out. I mean, we got a story coming out in CBS. We got a story in Time.
They get pieces, I think.
They get pieces.
They get pieces, but they don't have the courage to follow up and to actually connect the dots for people. So it's like they'll show you, hey, here's a little proof, but they don't show you the pattern. They don't say, look, let's take a step back and actually remember, because there's no history with mainstream media. That's the truth. There's no history to it. It's just kind of, there's an event here, an event there, a story here. So you can, if you're smart, you can start piecing things together. You can be like a Chomsky or others of these analysts who actually recognize and say, look, let's start to draw upon these mainstream news sources and actually, we can actually create a timeline, we can actually create a history, but the news itself is not going to do it for you. They're not going to tell you the history.
Yeah, and I think the other piece of it is, it's not about being an academic analyst here. It's about rolling up your sleeves, those people who know stuff, actually executing campaigns, challenging these guys. Because what they get away with is thinking that no one's going to challenge them. They get away with the concept that they're so strong. Monsanto's so big, and I've been told, they're going to threaten you, or Raytheon's so big. The fact is these guys aren't as big because there's 7.2 billion people on this planet,
Sure.
And a majority of them are not the 0.0001% who have wealth.
The people themselves have the power, but they don't recognize it as long as they're afraid or divided, which is how they like to keep us. Well, speaking of that, Jordan, what do you think are the major let's say archetypes, but the major dogmas that in the realm, whether it's scientific or religious, that you see are used to control us as a people, psychologically?
Well, I wanted to say that science, as we think of it, like I'm just going to call it white man science, has the privilege to almost say, oh, we're really growing as a science. We're seeing how things are interconnected, how this system affects this system. That's not a new science. That's the most ancient science of Ayurveda, Native American cultures. But because they're in a place of privilege, they sort of act like, oh, this is new. But actually, they're catching up. It's a ethnocentrism.
Well, I think a lot of quantum physics started to recognize that.
Yeah.
They started to look actually to the Vedic traditions and other more ancient cultures to recognize, oh, this is what those religions and spiritualities were always talking about, right? Whether it was Sufism or Gnosticism or Taoism.
Yeah, to answer your question, the biggest way is someone else telling you how to experience life, someone else saying, because you're asking the question, how does someone keep you asleep or keep you in a position?
Yeah.
Right from the beginning, we're told this is what your experience is of the moon, okay? You go to school, it's said that, it's made of this hydrogen. Psychology, even the field of psychology, will tell you how you should look at yourself, what's normal, what's healthy. The biggest way that we're kept powerless is by someone else telling us how we are to experience ourselves and things. But once you start experiencing things for yourself and going into it, then you awaken to real power. Even the Tao Te Ching, translated into English, means the way and its power. Nietzsche, he wrote a book, it's called The Will to Power. All these archetypes have to do with power. Even when someone enters a room, it's more about the vibration, how you're holding yourself, that speaks than what people say. It's all about that's why I said the individual. So the biggest way is something outside of you, whether that be a system, Monsanto, science, religion, saying this is how you are to experience life, or this is the range of possibilities you have. But once you go within yourself, you realize, no, there's he invented email through his own vision, yeah. So, but if he would have been told, oh, this is how you are to experience these systems, these are the range of possibilities only, and then took that as a way to experience, he's going to be stuck in a limited experience of life. So most people are having a very limited range of experience. That's why the sages use the word asleep.
Yes.
Most people are asleep. So.
Yeah, I think it's interesting what Jordan said when he referred to the email thing. Where did email come out of? Let's contrast it to what the military did. If you look at the ecosystem I had, it was loving parents, a public educational system, a mentor, and it was in Newark. You know, they say sometimes the lotus blossoms in the, you know, the hardest waters, right? That's where email came out of.
Yeah.
It didn't come out of...
This great picture too from 1980, the news article, right, of you in 1980.
Exactly. And
standing there, and it says email, and you're just a kid at 17.
Exactly. So email came out of that ecosystem. What they like to say is that was a triangle. You know, it was a spirit of love, cooperation, and it wasn't based on profit. And that's where all great innovations come from.
Right.
Great innovations came out of ordinary people solving a civilian problem. This kid was trying to take this woman who was relegated to the typewriter to the keyboard. I was trying to free her from the social barrier where people said, you could never use a computer. And email was the first application that did that, versus a narrative, no, we did it for sending military communications.
Yeah.
It's absolute nonsense.
But then, so do we think that really technology is a way for us to liberate, to wake up, to start to connect, to start to make those caste systems that we all are conditioned by?
I think what it is I think the deeper issue is who is making those decisions for us? Is it collectively being done, how we use technology, or is it a finite set of people doing that? Right now you have this very interesting thing. You have Buffett, you have Bill Gates starting these foundations, Zuckerberg. Well, it's a neo-form of an oligarchy, or it's an oligarchy, right? They're going to determine with their money, which should be actually tax dollars, which are skimming off so they could avoid estate taxes, and they're going to determine what's good for you and me. You see, it's a different form of neocolonialism. That's what's taking place. And the issue is we should collectively be making these decisions. And that is what, you know, we as a society should really start questioning. No matter how good people appear, they're so-called Trojan philanthropy. You know, it's really getting us back into this old model of a finite set of people controlling narratives. Maybe for good, maybe for bad. But I don't think that's what, you know, true democracy or radical democracy is about. Right.
But again, it would be through access to things like email, internet, and other forms that people can start to come together collectively.
Right, but if you look at email, in 1997, I went to the post office and I said, you know what, you guys should create a public version of email that is protected by all the privacy laws, which by the way exist for physical mail. If I sent you a physical mail and someone tampered with it, it's felony, even the government did. So they said, this is crazy, we shouldn't do it. Well, look who controls email today. It's private companies. Our email is not free. So-called free email is actually, if you read the privacy statements, it's controlled by those guys. They own our email.
Yeah.
There is no...
Because we're using their server.
Exactly. There's no public email. There's no public emails protected by the Constitution.
Yeah.
So this is a very, very issue about who could, you know, when Egypt occurred, Tahrir Square, you know, it was one thing when the students got involved. If you actually look at the archive, that when workers came out, overnight Mubarak calls up Vodafone and they shut down Twitter and everything. Right? So the issue is who's controlling media. Yeah. Right? Yeah, it's a few large telecom companies. So yeah, we have freedom, but when proverbially, let's say the shit hits a fan, or let's say a real popular movement takes place in this country, you can probably potentially have overnight blackouts too. So this is a very, very important, you know, question we should be discussing. Who's actually controlling, you know, the transport of communication nowadays? Yeah, obviously. I mean, we like to believe that it's our government, but unfortunately it's been obviously hijacked and taken over, and it doesn't seem to have any initiative to really help the peace of America or the rebuilding of America or growth of America. It's only this military, industrial, academic complex, financial complex really behind it. And to, I think what Jordan was saying, you know, when these detractors were attacking us, you know, me on the invention of email, one of my students, amazing kid, Devin Sparks, spent 3 months in the MIT library. He found a document written by this guy, David Crocker, who was attacking me. And the document is black and white. You know, we can probably put up the slide at some point, but it says, at this time, this is written in December 1977, no attempt is being made to emulate the inter-organizational mail system. He goes on to say it's impossible to do something like this. You see, for those guys who are essentially nerds, it was impossible that a secretary could ever use a computer and that you could create a system. So he wrote that. So when we put this up, this guy got very, very concerned. And we exposed them. So these guys always leave their trails. So it's very, very hard to get away from truth. That's what the positive thing is. Yeah. You know, you cannot get away from facts. Yeah, so at the end of the day, maybe we can simply say that, as Pontius Pilate asked, what is truth? Well, the truth is truth. And you can masquerade, you can hide behind it, but at the end of the day, there is a totality, a spiritual reality, and a truth that cannot be hidden, and we can find it within ourselves, within the greatness and the glory of all creation itself.
And well, let's hope that in this time period we'll see the unmasking and the unveiling of the forces that are trying to hide in the dark to manipulate us and control us, as we talked about today, whether it's from Monsanto or Raytheon or whatever corporation. We have to recognize that there is a desire to control us and keep us asleep. And through people like yourselves, we can hopefully gradually keep waking people up and nudging them into a new understanding of themselves and their own powers.
Definitely.
So let's leave it at that, and I will let people go to you guys for to find out more. Where can they find more of your work?
So my website is VA VictorAlphaShiva.com, and the slogan we have is "Know the truth, find your way, be the light," which is everyone should empower themselves to become a beacon for truth.
Exactly, fantastic. And Jordan, where can people find more from you?
They can go to jordanflesher.com, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. JORDANFLESHER.
Got it. Awesome. Thank you guys so much for coming on and talking with me today.
Great. Thanks for having us.
It's been fantastic.
Awesome.
Absolutely. Well, there you go, folks. Some great insights from these people. Hopefully, it'll help you to recognize again that the enemies are without and the truth is within. This is Sean Stone signing off.